morning again, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this webinar on media under attack. I'm Lucia Ardovini. I'm the director of the Richardson Institute at Lancaster University and the co-founder of the Tackling Transnational Repression group in the UK. So I will be moderating this session today. And in today's session, we will be focusing particularly on transnational repression or TNR, as I think we will be referring to it going on. And in particular, we will be looking at how journalists have increasingly become susceptible to TNR as a result of their work. So we have three amazing panelists today, and together we will explore what measures have been taken across Europe to push back against TNR, as well as we will be considering what further steps are needed in order to strengthen the existing protections that we have right now. So I will say that as most of us joining this call know, transnational repression refers to acts or threats against individuals, groups, and communities which take place across territorial borders, right? And these acts are carried out by government or their proxies, and in turn, they very much go to violate human rights, to intimidate, control, coerce, or silence dissent. What we also know is that TNR is on the rise globally. And this rise is being fueled by rapidly evolving technology, the global advance of authoritarianism, the conjoined erosion of democratic norms and standards. But really, this has been fueled by years of neglect by government and state bodies. So where this leaves us is with the fact that TNR is a major policy blind spot, which in turn has been resulting in significant constraints on the exercise of fundamental rights by a wide variety of communities and individuals. I think it's worth mentioning before we go into the discussion that over the past couple of years, I will say TNR, and particularly the question of how to respond to TNR from a legal and institutional standpoints, has been gaining salience. It has been gaining momentum at both the UK and the EU level. And we are currently seeing different measures that are being discussed at different levels, as I was saying. So some of these conversations have been centering around the EU Parliament recently voting in favor of two resolutions explicitly using TNR language. And most importantly, this resolution also remind member states of their legal obligations to put in place the necessary support networks to tackle TNR. Something that we're seeing domestically in the UK is the creation of a TNR task force, which operates across the Home and the Foreign Office as a result of the JCHR inquiry that was published last year. So these are positive movements. What we know, however, is that while these measures are slowly being discussed, the phenomenon keeps escalating. And so this is what we're really going to be focusing and discussing with our panelists today. So just to remind everybody of the format that we will be following today, we will be hearing from our three panelists, what we'll be introducing in a minute. The panelists have each been allocated 10 minutes to speak, which I realize is not that very long. I will try my very best to stick to the time. The discussion is going to be structured around these three rounds of moderated questions, and we are going to be having a Q&A at the end. So this is where I want to remind all of you in attendance that you can submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom during the interventions, and we will try our best to get to most of them at the end. This session is also being recorded, and it will be available online afterwards. So our panelists today are Basma Mustafa, who's the Director of Programs at the Law and Democracy Support Foundation and the co-spokesperson for the Coalition Against Transnational Repression in Germany. Then we have Emily Patterson, who is the Co-Executive Director of the State Capture Accountability Project, and Siena Antis, who's a Senior Legal Advisor at the Citizen Lab. I believe the longer bios are in the chat. So we are going to start with Basma in the interest of time. So welcome, Basma. Thank you for being here. And I was wondering if you would reflect on your experience and sort of like tell us what broader patterns you're seeing in how transnational repression affects journalists and media workers in general, as well as speaking to the barriers that might prevent them from speaking out or seeking support from authorities.
Thank you, Lucia, and thank you all for having me today. So transnational repression targeting journalists usually doesn't take the form of a single incident. It's operate of a pattern of conduct. Journalists are often targeted through a combination of tactics, not just one. This can include online harassment, smear campaign, and legal pressure at the same time, physical assault, harassment against the family back home. There is also increasing use of proxies and the informal network, which make threat harder to identify. And for journal and also the denial of having documentation by the counselor of service, and many of these action actually designed to stay below the criminal threshold, which make them difficult to report or even recognize as a pattern of this conduct. And in many cases, what individual experience also is not immediately believed, and this can be a doubt, and people can be described as a paranoid or simply not taken seriously. And I can share from my experience. So in Germany, I was physically assaulted and subjected to online defamation campaign, calls for rape, threat against my children, threat using my home address, hacking my accounts, and surveillance by diplomat and civilians proxies between 2022 and 2024. And in mid 2024, I was threatened inside a hotel in Geneva threaten was about arresting on the spot. And between August and September 2025, I was targeted again online with a defamation campaign, and my family in Egypt received online threat, and I received also a lot of threat of violence through WhatsApp and threat offline, including kidnapping from Berlin and sending me back to Egypt in a car. And I try to make this timeline of incident to show how that TNR is not one incident; it's ongoing pressure on against the journalist and the human rights defender in exile. And in June 2026, we received a threatened phone call on our organization number states that our work threatens the Egyptian national security, and indicating that they have a network of Egyptian across Europe. I don't know why the caller mentions this. And actually, this lead directly to the main barriers. One of the biggest barriers that journalists are not believed when they report about TNR threat. There is also a fear of escalation, especially when family member against family member back to our home country. And there is also a lack of trust in institution, either due previous experience or because responses are by the authority, host state authority, are slow or unclear. So many journalists remain silent or try to manage their situation on their own. And also from I have also experience, I can share it when it's come to reporting TNR across different countries in the EU or within the UK. So the agent who actually, so I was subjected again by to harassment by a network of proxies and diplomat working together across several EU states, and especially the individual who physically assaulted me in Berlin, he is based in the UK. So in Germany, after 3 years of attempting to report this incident across different authority, no one of them was equations. And I submit another case in Netherlands, and actually my complaint was not never respond to it. And in the UK last year, for me it was really the perhaps the most difficult experience, because I had to communicate with the UK through the email in order to report the agent who attacked me in Berlin. And over a period of 2 months, I faced like a lot of obstacles that made it extremely difficult to file a formal complaint because I am based in Berlin and I want to submit in the UK, and the Home Office asked me to submit it to the UK police, and I don't know how I can do this from Berlin, and I ask them to provide me like with a contact point or to designate responsible police officer to receive my complaint, and they refused. So I had to conduct the police in the UK through the online form, and like dozen of online form I did it, and the response I received directed me back to the German police. So it's a limbo, kind of limbo. And actually, most of the some of the response I received by the UK police indicate a lack of understanding of my complaint, despite the fact I was using the same terminology outlined in the official Home Office guidelines on transnational repression, and even I reference the National Security Act 2023. And then I was only able to submit my formal complaint through a voluntary human rights lawyer based in the UK. We submit this case to the counterterrorism unit, which did officially receive the complaint. However, to date, we have not received any information regarding my complaint or a follow-up or outcome. So
Mm.
experience like mine do not encourage others to report any incident to the police, and in the end journalists carry this burden of everything on their own, documenting the incident, collect evidence, trying to prove it, submit it to the police, and then nothing happened. And actually the most difficult thing for me as exile journalist from Egypt doesn't know anything about the legal system in the UK, doesn't know anything about the legal system
Yeah.
in Germany. So I have to navigate different legal system to find the function authority responsible, or have the authority to investigate all of this incident.
Yeah. So on the piggybacking on what you were just saying, Basma, because obviously you've really been outlining sort of how much of this burden is on the targets themselves, right? From the other side, in your experience, what do you see being the biggest challenges for governments when it comes to identifying the phenomenon in order to then respond to it, right?
So I think governments still face several key challenges when it comes to identify and respond to transnational repression. There is a huge gap in recognized TNR tactics. Many cases are not understood as a part of this conduct pattern of conduct,
Mm-hmm.
and rather than they treat it as insulated incidents, so the authority cannot see the full picture of the repression. And much of journalists experience also fell below the criminal threshold, which means it's not recognized by law, so the authority have to find a way to respond to this tactics fell under threshold. And also there is a lot of there is a lack of clear and dedicated mechanism for reporting. Many journalists and human rights defenders simply don't know where to go or how to navigate different authority across countries. And based on my experience, reporting across different countries can be extremely exhausted, and you are often redirected between institutions required to repeat the same information, and in the end there is no outcome. And there is also a point of restructure issue that frontline authority are often not trained to recognize the patterns, the techniques of transnational repression. So even when journalists came forward, their experience may not be probably understood or registered or investigated. There is also a lack of coordination, both within the state and between different authority, between the states themselves, and this become particularly challenging in cases involving proxies, like my case. So there is a cross-border elements between the perpetrators and themselves, which required transnational response between also states. And also this coordination gap often shift the burden into the target individual who ends up navigate this multi-system alone. I do also see some important sign of progress, to be honest. So if I will compare the situation now back to 2022, when all of this started with me, there is a very clear shift. At the same time, if it felt like is yeah. So back to 2022, I was like feeling speaking to the avoid to myself. There is no recognition. There is no shared language about transnational repression to describe was happening. But today also there is much more awareness of transnational repression, as you mentioned, both at the policy level and with the civil society between the civil society. And also this recognition itself has a real impact for me as a Basma. It made a real difference. I no longer feel what I experience is dismissed, and I feel like I'm start process to heal something from inside. And the collective action around this issue also not helping only me, but I guess helping a lot of other journalists who not may spoke publicly about their situation. And also so but there is still a long way to translate all of this awareness into a coordination action and effective protection. And so there is like some tiny move in Germany. So transnational repression, for example, was moved into the political agenda. Last month, the Ministry of Interior has published a guideline. It's similar to the guideline in the UK on transnational repression, also in multiple language. There is also a sign of more special sorry, a special special institutional response within the law enforcement. So there are now dedicated unit engaged with transnational repression inside the police. And I received I received just the email from them 3 days ago or 4 days ago, something around that. They said like they received my case and they are the new unit responsible about transnational repression, and we would like to invite you for a meeting to discuss your case again. And in the signature they wrote transnational repression unit. So for like something simple to see transnational repression unit formally acknowledged in official communication toward targeted individual has to endure all of this since 2022. It felt really different.
Yeah, yeah. And
Um,
thank you for sharing, Basma. And I think it's important to acknowledge what you were saying about there is progress. However, a lot of this progress is happening at the sort of like national level, and this coordination gap that you've been pointing to it's really a big source of why this remains sort of like a gray policy area when it comes to sort of like the international framework, right? So I'm afraid I'm gonna have to stop you there, but like thank you so much for sharing your experience. And we are now going to move on to Siena, who will be talking to us about the digital aspect of TNR. So Sienna, I was wondering if you could reflect on how you see TNR evolving in the digital space, specifically in how it has to do with the targeting of journalists, and also the million-dollar question: what should governments do to tackle or to better tackle TNR as it happens on the digital stage?
Thanks, Lucia. So I'm Sienna. I'm the Senior Legal Advisor at the Citizen Lab. We've been studying digital transnational oppression over the past few years. And just in case there's, individuals in the audience who have never heard this term, it's essentially just transnational oppression, but being perpetrated through the method of using digital technologies. So I think the methods used against journalists are essentially the same used against human rights defenders or other members of civil society in exile. So I wouldn't say there's something particular that jumps out at me. The technologies and sort of methods being used are quite varied, which is why digital transnational oppression, or DTR, is such a formidable tool, right? It's highly adaptable, it can be used against different targets, different situations, cheap to deploy, easy to deploy, difficult to attribute back to the state. So what we're seeing is online monitoring and surveillance of social media accounts, the use of phishing, malware, and spyware that provide unauthorized access to data, for example, on a phone, and then facilitate the exfiltration of that data and the use of that data by the state, who's perpetrating transnational oppression, account takeovers that provide access to the data within the account, but also lock a user out so they can't actually get any work done, and have their communications affected that way. Online harassment and trolling is significant. That's a really big bucket of activity that we're seeing that affects journalists and others. So this is activity online that seeks to discredit, embarrass a target. This is accompanied with defamation and smear campaigns online and online disinformation. So as I said, there's a real varied set of options for perpetrating states that want to engage in transnational oppression across borders. And digital technologies, it's easier to use these methods than to send, for example, an agent into Canada or the UK to engage in physical transnational oppression. That being said, and I think Basma made a really important point, is that it's never just like one method used and that's it, right? So digital transnational oppression is part of a suite of methods that are used to target someone. And I think it's probably safe to say that DTR is what we would see at the beginning, and it would escalate to physical forms of transnational oppression towards the end. So I think, like I'll get back to some examples after. One issue that we're seeing that has changed in the past year is, of course, the integration of AI, the greater accessibility for the general public for AI tools. So this can help facilitate the creation of like really convincing fake videos, photos that can then be used to defame, embarrass, discredit, shame, and isolate journalists. It also facilitates the creation of fake text that can be used in online disinformation, harassment campaigns that makes it very difficult to then determine, is this disinformation? Is this something else? Who could we attribute it to? So it just creates incredible challenges for research. It also, can facilitate the creation of text that is then used in highly sophisticated phishing campaigns. So that is a very concerning aspect that is more recent that also needs to be addressed. And so I was thinking about this morning when I was preparing for this, and I think there are very specific. So the methods used against journalists are the same, I would say, against human rights defenders, for example, or other members of civil society. But of course, I think the impact on journalists are particular to the professional journalism in particular. So, one thing that comes to mind is that digital transnational oppression makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for journalists to keep sources safe. So if you can't keep if you can't keep your source safe, then you can't do your work, right? So people won't provide you with information, or if you try to reach out to someone, you risk their lives. And this is particularly in the case where sort of like coercion by proxy. Let's say the source is in the country perpetrating transnational oppression. The journalist is now in exile but wants to speak to that source. I mean, it creates significant challenges in terms of being able to do that work. And then the use of online harassment and smear campaigns, especially I think it's been particularly violent against women, can lead to a journalist being discredited by their community. These smear campaigns can be incredibly effective. It can end their careers as journalists. Some people just withdraw because it's too much, or because it just becomes impossible to communicate out information. And then, of course, like I said, like Basma had pointed out earlier, it's never just one method. So I think the example of Jamal Khashoggi, for example, is a really important one because it shows us that for example, targeting with spyware, the electronic armies, the online harassment was one part of it, leading eventually to his killing in Turkey. So I think so that brings me more to sort of the second question which was on what should host states do? And it's a challenging question to answer in a short amount of time. And I think it also depends on the jurisdictions, on different contexts. But I think that it was a really good point made earlier by Basma that I think the state needs to realize that there's a spectrum of methods being used against targets, and that digital transnational oppression has to be taken seriously. It will likely be the beginning of what is a sustained and long campaign against an individual, leading not only to harms online, but also to physical harms. So that's one important thing to keep in mind, just about how transnational repression works. And then I'd like to divide up sort of the recommended responses that host states should take into about three buckets. So the first is first-hand support to targets of digital transnational oppression and also transnational oppression, but I'll focus on the digital aspects. So technical and digital security assistance. So some kind of mechanism of rapid response and direct technical advice to DTR targets in cases of digital security emergencies. So right now, for example, when someone asks me, this event happened, what do I do? There's certain civil society resources that are out there, but in terms of being able to say, hey, you can go to this like this entity in your host state, and they will be able to provide you with specific digital security advice, that I can't usually do. So I think that's a very big gap to fill. Then there's also, I think, sort of like ancillary services that are also really important, but are sort of longer term. So access to legal counsel, if someone wants to sort of document and bring a civil claim, for example, and then psychosocial support, which is so important because this is such a long-term traumatic set of events that affect someone's life, as Basma described so well. And then in the second bucket, I would look at prevention, so different strategies and methods for prevention. So one important thing is I think host states helping finance or deliver digital security training through community organizations that work with individuals who are at high risk. So one initiative I thought was interesting a few years ago was, for example, a refugee resettlement organization that when they do their incoming, like the first meeting when someone is claiming refugee status, for example, in Canada, is to provide like a serious digital security advice to that person, potentially replacement devices so they can archive their existing devices and save them in case there's a law enforcement, there's some kind of legal action later. So that I think is really important and to build that out. And I know the Canadian government, for example, has been talking to community organizations. So it's a matter now, I think, of talking to actual action. And then secure reporting mechanisms that should be set up by host states. I mean, we've talked about that a lot, and especially for, there's not just for digital, but also physical acts of transnational oppression. And I think, governmental cybersecurity organizations play a key role in gathering information and sharing it with the public. So when they engage in threat intelligence research, attributing attacks to perpetrators, and so on, making sure that information ends up in the hands of the communities who are being affected is really important because it's only that way that communities are able to inform themselves on potential threats. So I think I'll leave it at that. I can talk. I don't know, Lucia, if I have a few more minutes, but I have some specific examples of good. So there's been from the Canadian context, and I'd be curious to hear more about the UK context as well. There have been some positive steps. So I think we're very much in a time where, as Basma had described, like it's not 2022 where no one knew what we were talking about. But now we're in a period where the language is crystallizing, the definition is crystallizing, but now it's a matter of translating that into concrete action, and that is always difficult, especially with competing policy priorities that change. So we did see with the in the Canadian context, the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism Canada, they've been reporting on different digital transnational repression campaigns. So I think in terms of informing communities what kinds of digital attacks they might be facing, that's really important because I think and Basma, tell me if you disagree, but I think for someone who's facing this type of activity, being able to see that it's like something that's out there that is happening to other people allows you to connect it to other people's experiences and realize that it's not you're on your own, but there's a whole network of people who are being affected in the same way. And I think that's quite powerful. There's also been efforts to publish compendiums of measures to counter transnational oppression, which have included aspects of digital transnational oppression, investments, for example, in a global fund, so combining resources with other states to specifically target the issue of cybersecurity and defense for civil society organizations. That's also been positive. As I said earlier, we've seen in Canada meetings with community organizations where the different Canadian government institutions and agencies are reaching out to the communities to really try and understand specifically what they can do. Although I do feel like we're sort of waiting now for what are they going to do, right, with that information. So that's a critical step that needs to be translated. And then I think it's positive. As I mentioned, I think government information gathering and research that then is translated to the public is critical. So the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, for example, has now quite more frequently talked about different digital transnational repression campaigns that they are observing. And we've also seen the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity issuing guidelines to civil society for how to mitigate digital transnational repression. All that to say, there's no like one single thing that is going to address the issue. But I think all these measures taken together is sort of starting to make a bit of a dent in the situation.
Yeah, and thanks so much for that, Sienna. And I think um, one of the things to take away from what you were saying in Basma as well is the fact that a lot of the advancements and the movements that we're saying are really the results of like years of advocacy efforts by targets themselves, their communities, their support networks. Like these are finally managed, I think, to make this a high ticket agenda item. But as you were saying, now we need to see how we're gonna put that in action within the institutional and policy frameworks that we have, right? And this is where we come to Emily, really, where I think it would be great if you could comment on where we are at when it comes to like policy and legal developments in tackling TNR at the UK and the European level, and then more specifically also about your work with state capture. Like you guys have recently released a lot of recommendations for policymakers. So what do you think are the most pressing ones that we should really be looking at as a matter of priority?
Sure. So I'll sort of start out with the summary of what the main gaps are in the EU and the UK frameworks because they're generally the same or very similar, right? So one of the first is that there's no shared international definition of TNR. So as a starting point, it would be good to have one definition, an international, or since we're focusing on Europe, a European Council of Europe definition of TNR. It's often defined in policy documents, but it's not a legal definition. So it's still subject to different interpretation, right? And it's very often, this lack of definition also means that it's often sort of subsumed into foreign interference national security frameworks, which can make exiled communities look more as a threat to the state, not as people who are undeserving of protection. And Basma's experience like lays out exactly the things that we have sort of pointed out as patterns where the legal frameworks are insufficient. Like sanctions and criminal regimes are designed for the most egregious violations, torture, extrajudicial killing, and forced disappearance. That's what those legal regimes do. But as we have heard quite well explained, PNR usually stays below that threshold. It's cumulative, it's indirect, it's like coercion with the veneer of legality, so it's really hard to put your finger on something. This kind of sustained intimidation, harassment, reputational attacks on family back home, it just doesn't meet an evidentiary bar or a severity bar to reach any of those legal frameworks, leaving victims with no protection essentially. So this sort of violation-based legal framework does not comport well with the networked and dispersed way that regimes to perpetrate their TNR, right? It's a combination of things. It's not like you do one thing. And there's also not one act or one perpetrator, which would which would fit well under an existing legal framework. It just doesn't quite work that way. These particular regimes also really don't do well at abuse of a legal process, like Interpol red notices or mutual legal assistance abuse or politically motivated extraditions. And they also don't, address the issues of property coercion, right? So denied inheritance, abusive taxation, bank de-risking kinds of things. And the other big gap we see, which is clearly evident in especially in Basma's stories, is the lack of coordinated information sharing, both within one country and internationally. So there's just no bodies really that help do that, and data tends to still come from underfunded civil society sources. So briefly, before I get into our recommendations, we have identified some best practices that I think you've also pointed out very well, like the need for a specialist task force. And that's where things have improved. Like in the UK, there's some movement to have a coordinated approach to DNR. Canada also is doing better on developing a coordinated approach. My understanding is that Australia as well, I know we're focusing on Europe, but Australia as well also has done a better job. Another thing that also came up that we also came up in looking at these various systems is there's not accessible reporting, like a dedicated hotline or a web portal operated by individuals who understand what it is that it's not a crime victims hotline, right? It's a TNR hotline that is, manned by personnel who are trained in the political context, are trained in identifying what counts as TNR, and are familiar with the resources available and the legal, framework available to help guide victims of TNR to the right resources. Community-facing outreach. I was really impressed, Sienna, what you mentioned about refugee resettlement agencies in Canada, and in a previous lifetime where I worked in refugee resettlement in the United States, and that would have been beyond anybody's comprehension, although TNR is a different situation now. So our point is generally, right, any practice that centers DNR on victims and not on a national security framework is critical. I mean, a national security framework can be good because along with national security is resources and attention, right? But it also, as we pointed out, risks treating exiled communities as suspects. So we advocate for a human rights victim-centered approach that has explicit safeguards. So we made 3 proposals. I'm not sure where I am on time. I forgot to look when I started, but
we're about halfway through, so you got time.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have 3 general broad proposals. One is for a Council of Europe framework on TNR, and the other 2 proposals are to the UK and the EU to develop a TNR sanctions regime. So our sort of advocacy for what should be incorporated in a Council of Europe TNR regime is a definition as a starting point, right? So a definition where all, signatory states would have the same definition of TNR, victim-centered definition. Also that all specific TNR conduct is listed, from, extrajudicial killings to slaps to proxy targeting to unlawful asset appropriation, that it sort of really clearly sets out what the common TNR acts are to help guide, essentially law enforcement, right, in signatory states. We would suggest that a COE convention also have a harmonized definition of causing harm through transnational repression, and but that definition, the convention should be clear that it should be a distinct offense. It should include modes of liability. It should include liability of legal persons, not just natural persons. Also set out what aggravating circumstances could be. A COE convention should also set out what the host state duties are in terms of protection, so that it could also bring in this sort of sub-criminal conduct or the conduct that is not going to quite reach, law enforcement action. Also, we would recommend that a convention includes some kind of foreign policy coordination, so coordinated targeted sanctions, export controls on surveillance technology, and spyware, withdrawal of diplomatic accreditation, expulsion of diplomats coming from TNR countries, and an intergovernmental cooperation body. It seems so painfully obvious sometimes, but these things in all contexts, I guess, have to be said, right? An intergovernmental cooperation body and monitoring mechanism so everybody shares information and tracks what everyone is doing, and it should be binding. Because as I'm sure you all know, there have been cases where the European Court has actually failed to protect people who were subject to transnational repression. So there are obviously gaps in the European system. So the EU sanctions regime should be distinct from the human rights regime. And the EU's human rights regimes is a bit broader and accounts for more conduct than the UK or the US human rights regimes, but still, as a policy matter and as a matter for getting the EU to actually move forward on something, which can be difficult, we are recommending also the creation of an EU sanctions regime that includes a definition of TNR. Yeah, and that helps countries sort of also more clearly see what action could be taken, and like this behavior is wrong, it's sanctionable, so to sort of inspire hopefully some action. Same thing with the UK, right? So add a UK TNR regime under the Sanction and Money Laundering Act. The UK's human rights sanction regime is much more restrictive, requires much more harm to the victim. An advantage of these sanctions regimes is that they have a lower evidentiary threshold than a criminal proceeding, but also it's you name a perpetrator, and then the perpetrator's assets can be seized. There can be immigration restrictions, a bar on making funds available to them and those related to them. Again, it would encompass export restrictions. So it's just another sort of toolkit. But I think really like a Council of Europe convention that everyone accedes to, which really sets out policies, sets out intergovernmental cooperation, starts with the notion of a victim-centered approach, with the idea that protection is really the fundamental thing, that maybe this is an issue related to human rights, related to national security, but fundamentally it's also about democracy. Like the EU Parliament's resolution that came out last week, towards an EU strategy to protect Europe's sovereignty and democratic values. Not really a national security angle, but it does make a good sell, I think, domestically. So I will stop there because I think we have very little time for questions. So thank you a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Emily. And I think that just to follow up directly on your last point, Anna Newman, who put forward that resolution that was passed last week, is also doing a lot of work in pushing for a legally binding definition of TNR at the Council of Europe level. IPHR is also doing that. Obviously, we all know that these processes are painfully slow, but I think it's quite interesting that you've all highlighted the need of a definition as a starting point. Really, in order to guide the responses of different kinds. So just a reminder to everybody that you can submit your questions. I have some questions that have been submitted already, so we can now move on to the Q&A part of this session. And I want to start with this question that is open to all of you, really, which maybe shifts the focus a little bit from straight actors to private actors, right, as perpetrators of TNR. So specifically when it comes to big media companies, right, do you have any indication that media companies in the UK or in Europe might actually be working with authoritarian states in their reporting, in their framing of TNR, or even unintentionally aiding the process of misrepresenting what TNR is about? Anybody who would like to take that? It is a hard one. We can park that for now. And we can talk about maybe how do we see broader best practices, I guess, of TNR, in addressing TNR, as you guys have all been addressing them. Do we need to take the step further and look at the intersectional nature of the threats? Do we really need to look at issues of gender and race and where the targets are coming from? And if so, how do we integrate those practices into the systems that we have already?
I
I'm
can
happy.
start.
Oh,
Oh,
no,
go ahead.
Emily, please start, and then we'll have Sienna.
So one of the things that I think is recommended in the European Parliament a resolution, and also that we have thought about is data collection, right? So the way you keep the data should reflect different risks based on groups, right? And another thing is because like affected communities are the ones that are like first responders to an incident of transnational repression, it would be important to draw from them how to incorporate an intersectional perspective. Yeah, I would.
Yeah, I can maybe add to that. So the Citizen Lab's last report on digital transnational repression looked specifically at the gender aspects of this practice. And I think the main finding is that so we spoke with women, human rights defenders, journalists, members of civil society, so fairly broad cross-section of professions. And the impacts of transnational oppression on women are particularly severe. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this is only going to get worse with online disinformation, harassment, and so on being fueled by AI. So I think, I mean, there's different ways to address that. I think, for example, where digital security training is being delivered, it can't just be agnostic to the experiences and the backgrounds of the individuals that are participating in that training, right? So if you provide training that is just like very pro forma, just very general in nature, it's going to have very limited applicability to, for example, a group of women journalists who are being harassed online. So I think we need to think about tailoring policy responses to in that sense.
Yeah, and I think the next question that I want to sort of like bring up is has got to do exactly with the speed of that change. Like something that you've all been talking about is just how different techniques and strategies of TNR look now from they were looking like in 2022, for example, because they evolve over time. So this question is particularly about the digital landscape, but I think we can maybe like expand it in a broader way. So the question is, with the digital landscape being in such rapid and constant change, will a strict legal definition of TNR risk falling short if the digital threats and strategies used against journalists change? And I think that, like, obviously there's a very specific digital angle here, but in general, because we see this phenomenon changing all the time. Emily, I see you wanting to come in.
Trying to find my mic button. Yeah, this is the trick of legislative drafting for anything, right? I mean, it's a totally fair question, and I get it. I'm looking over here because I'm trying to copy our proposed definition together with IPHR in our recommendation, and I'll just stick it in here in the answer if that works.
I see you typing, so probably.
Okay. Yeah, so but yes, I mean it's a fair point. So it takes a lot of thinking. To come up with a definition that doesn't subject itself to, well, obsolescence, or as the US some jurisprudence would say, multifarious interpretation. So
yeah.
Yeah, I just to add to that, I mean, I hesitate sometimes. I'm specifically working on this idea of like a legal definition of digital transnational oppression, and I think that there's merit to the sort of more policy, I don't know, like non-legal and then a very legal one. So if you think about like a legal definition of transnational oppression in the context of criminal law, like you'd want it to be very narrow. For example, if you're going to increase penalties for specific acts that are acts of transnational oppression, in order to avoid abuse, right? Like, so it does have to be relatively specific. But then when I think about the policy developments around transnational oppression, I think we want to make sure we're just talking about the same thing, right? So that the important thing there is just identifying the key features of the practice. And I don't think the fact that the digital landscape is changing is particularly problematic because like the different methods being used are relatively stable. And what we're seeing now is for example, what you mentioned with AI is that it's sort of enriching and making it easier to engage in the methods of digital transnational repression that we see. And I think if the digital methods were to change, it would still fall under transnational oppression because we're talking about a specific set of like a specific type of behavior that we've identified through this more general definition. So I think the issue is that there might be different definitions in different contexts. I don't know. That's maybe not such a helpful response this year.
No, I think it is. And also, like, thank you, Emily, for like sharing the definition and the work of APHR as well, because I think that that speaks to the, as you were saying, like the legal difficulty in producing something that is narrow but broad enough at the same time to capture this. I want to go back to Basma because we have a question that I think is specifically speaking to like personal experiences and to the gender angle, right? So the question is, do you think that women will feel safer submitting group complaints than rather than filing a complaint on their own, especially if this is a systematic issue that we're looking at?
Um, mass complaint, or would women feel safer submitting mass complaint?
So like group
This is
complaints, right? So
this
like
is the
women coming
question.
forward with shared experiences.
Um, I don't know. We never think about this option, but I guess it's required to have some common in this mass complaint because yes, there is like a specific about the threat and the perpetrator who commit this crime and stuff. So I never think. I never, as a person, think about it, or as a coalition, or as NGO, because I think legal complaint, it should be specific about some conduct, some perpetrators, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, stuff like this. Um, but for me, as a person, I encourage everyone who experience TNR who go and report even if the structure is still unclear, and if even if we in as a target individual endure some of this burden, but
Mm-hmm.
as I understand what not documented we cannot address. So if we need to address transnational repression more and more, we have to report all of this
Mm-hmm.
incident, even if under the threshold. And regarding, I would like to just add one point regarding the digital landscape, because
Yeah.
in Egypt context we have experienced something really new. And I don't know if these tools or techniques used in different context or not, but usually the Egyptian government use blocking against the media website and human rights organization website, and even media website in exile. But recently they use the block tools against a Facebook account for individual, for journalists and blogger, artists, opposition, like a group of 10 dissident in exile. Their accounts on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube was blocked inside Egypt. So I think, yeah, the digital landscape and the techniques in and TNR really development a lot, more than the past year, even not like
Mm.
2 years ago or something.
Yeah, no, I think that's a useful reflection. And also like to go back to the question of mass complaints or group complaints. I mean, I agree with you, Basma, in the sense that like we need individual experiences coming forward. Like we need an idea of exactly who this is happening to. By obviously, I'm aware there are security and privacy concerns when it comes to that. I also think that that depends on what you're trying to do with your complaint. Like for example, with the during the JCHR inquiry last year, there were a lot of group submissions, so submissions on behalf of particular communities or particular group of individuals, but that was more of the effort there was to raise awareness rather than seeking sort of like a legal answer to what was happening. So there is a multi-level different dynamics and process that are at play here. So a question that I want to get to is, do any of you have any suggestions for increasing the trust for right defenders and exiled journalists in national institutions. Like we know that the lack of trust plays massively in underreporting, right? And that is particularly important because solutions are reliant on state authorities being able to work with the victim. So how do we go about repairing or rebuilding this trust, do you think? Basma, please go ahead.
First of all, anyone can want to go to the police to report some incident or something. You have the right to bring someone you trust with you if you're afraid to be with the police in the same room, if you or if you have like previous bad experience with the police authority in your country. Also, you could request from the police to bring someone from the like I don't know what is the situation in the UK, but I reflect on on Germany. So here you can request that the police brings like psychological support from the protection unit for the victim. So you will have like a psychological support with you during the visit or the meeting with the police. Also, if you like, you can ask for it's your right by law in Germany to ask for a translator if you are not speaking good German. So this is a three thing could make you feel at least like establish connection with the police. And I did this most of the time. Like when I go to the police, I bring my lawyer, bring it another person I trust. I ask for like a psychological support for translation. And I usually keep in my mind that like they are a police officer in the end, so their mindset it's not thinking out the box of criminal mindset, so they might not understanding what I am saying actually or what I am trying to report about it, but I'm keep most of the time I doesn't care that if they understand or not. I'm keep pushing, keep like explain a lot, even if this not something easy. And it's what I'm saying. It's not a recommendation. I only share, I reflect on my personal experience because I guess everyone experience is different. So this is what helped me like during the communication with the police. I'm also most of the time ask for support from civil society actor around me to ask them what should I do when I be in contact with authority. So it's also this is the most thing I can recommend, that to ask for support, not to be alone in the process, even if you are under pressure or even if you are going to report to authority, even if you feel like overwhelming or like what's happening right now, it's too much. Really, what helped me a lot to ask for support from whatever civil society or activists, journalists around me.
Yeah, and I think that like these points are very, very important to keep in mind. I would also add to that something that we hear a lot from targets and from communities, that like trust is also built on responses. Like you need to see that action is being taken, and that would be one of the ways for more people to come forward, rather than having to recall and re-explain their traumatizing experience over and over again for that to lead to nowhere in most cases. Like we need to see those responses taking place, and that is a small but gigantic step, I think, at the same time to put forward in order to rebuild trust. So I'm aware we need to wrap up in about 1 minute. So I'm just wondering if any of you want to share any final thoughts before we do that?
I just want to reiterate the last point you made, because I think it's most important and it can happen quickly, right? These structures need to function so that Basma doesn't have to go to 2 different countries to try and get some accountability. You know what I mean? And that would be step one.
Yeah, Sienna?
Yeah, and I think sort of the theme coming out from this is that we're at a point of translating words and research and knowledge gathering into action. So I would underline that as being really important in the next few months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is something that we can all take away from this today. It feels like we are very much at a watershed point when it comes to translating, as Sienna was saying, everything that different actors, different targets, different bodies have been working on for the past few years, and taking all that knowledge into different actions. I think something else that we can take away as well is the need for coordination not just within different national contexts, but across the EU as well, in order to put forward something that works for, well, maybe not for everybody at the very beginning, but at least for most people, which is more than what we can say in terms of what we have right now. So with that somewhat positive note, I think we will close discussion here, and I want to thank all of you for sharing your work and your experiences with us today, and thank you for all the questions that have been asked as well. And just a final reminder that this will be online after this is over. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.